nation to know each other. Yet people perceive themselves as belonging and communing together. So there is a dream that we project and that we subscribe to. There is nation as destination, nation that is a receding image left behind. And oddly, what figures in our memory and grief, this place left behind, may become years later the place of promise, of acceptance and welcome. And the past and present converge and collide in dimensions that surprise and enrich us. And two, nation yields the reality of race. The systemic racism in the United States is a crucial aspect of the Korean American journey. Stolen land, genocide, slavery. This has made our Korean American experience what it is. It's our confrontation, our complicity, our reaction, our pain with how this history affects us that makes us. And this question exists in every work of literature that is written, whether or not it directly addresses it, because we as Korean Americans are wholly affected by race in the US. Korean American literature, American literature, this is what it speaks to. So we live then in the myth of nation, in the complication of memory, and in the certainty of movement, in hope that we want to achieve some kind of unity in self and community. And this quest to unity is the truth of all art. Art's purpose is to bring us unity, and that's literature too. So there's the early literature. Now, stories from the very early days of Korean American life were uncommon. And if you look at the dates, you can see that it was often decades later that stories, especially those by women, were published. These writings were autobiographical. They were for family, and they were often extremely biased or limited in viewpoint. Yet writing is a part of nation building. And this is the significance of these works. These early writers, many couldn't be Americans legally due to immigration policy. Henry Kim, he's down there on the far right, he wrote with extreme bias about his experiences in the political arena, about the jealousies and rivalries and power grabs within the Korean independence movement. And while he spent nearly his entire life in Hawaii in what became the US, he still wrote in Korean. But I consider his writing very Korean American, given his subject matter and his legal position. Ron Young Kim was the first to write the Korean American woman's experience in LA in the 1920s. Mary Peck Lee's life story wasn't released until several years before her death. And Daisy Chun Rhodes' recordings are simply that, recordings of oral histories of the first wave of Korean Americans. Yet when we read these works, we understand our early days in the United States. Young-Hil Kang was the very first American writer of Asian descent to achieve critical and commercial success, a true literary figure. Sue Sien Far, a woman, was a Canadian of Chinese and British descent, writing stories in the 1890s, but Young-Hil Kang was the first to write the Asian American experience to a wider audience. He wrote 2 memoirs. He was an anti-Japanese activist, briefly imprisoned, then he fled to the West. He worked with the famous New Yorker editor Maxwell Perkins, who edited Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. While he initially wrote in Korean and in Japanese, his white American wife, Frances Stacy Keeley, encouraged him to write in English. And despite bills before Congress on his own behalf, he was never able to acquire US citizenship. I think eventually he did, but almost at the end of his life. So he addresses the question of race too. In the last pages of his memoir, he dreams, there's a dream sequence of he and a Black man are both trapped in this idea and promise of what America is supposed to be. Tragically, he died in relative obscurity, and only now is he reissued and published again. He could never land a full-time job as a professor, though he was a prolific translator and editor. He was stateless, affected by legal issues. He married after the Cable Act of 1922, which was a law that would strip a white woman of her citizenship should she marry someone like him, a Korean. He was essentially a genius that the US could never fully accept. Carlos Bulosan, who's right there down on the far right corner, he was the widely read Filipino-American author of America's the Heart in 1946. And he credited Kang. So we can only create what we can imagine. And Younghil Kang paved the way for Bulosan, who paved the way in turn for every writer of Asian descent in the US. Kang set the blueprint. After he wrote, others wrote, and in turn, we believe what we could write, but it's down to him. Every single piece of Asian American literature you read now, you can point to it. There was a Korean American godfather of everything. Next, we have Richard Kim. He was the only Asian American ever nominated for the Nobel Prize. His novel, The Martyred, about the Korean War and Christianity, spent 20 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It was influenced by the French existentialist Albert Camus. The novel was deeply significant, and there were many things at play: Korean Christians, communists, war, faith, what we believe. It was about the set around the Korean War, and Lost Names was about boyhood under Japanese occupation. So think about this. The war really was about the US and Russia, the Korean War. He writes of Japan in English, of Christians who were Korean. I mean, Christianity was hardly well established in the 1950s in Korea. So this is really polyculturalism, the play of cultures, the exchange and sharing. This is what is in his work. So Korean American writers obviously are influenced by multiple cultures and ideas. And this ability to synthesize, yet not to deny our existence, is what made Kim's writing epic in heart, global in scope. The 60s brought Asian American women to the forefront. So writing is an active imagination, but it is always affected by the times. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. Then in 1965, the Hart-Celler Act increased the number of people immigrating from Asia and Africa. And this was the dawn of the second wave feminism movement. So to many, the 60s and 70s was reviewed as the initial Asian American political movement and creative renaissance. And Korean American women were writing. In fact, Korean American women led with some radical firsts. And these women traced their lineage to the very first wave of immigration. The very first Asian American lesbian poet of repute was Willis Kim. She was born in Hawaii. She collaborated with other women of color and very much documented the women experience. You have to think about it. Just writing about women working, being together, never mind sexual engagement. This was completely radical for the time. And Kathy Song was a lyric poet, or is, she's still alive, of Chinese and Korean descent. And she was the first Asian American to take the Yale Younger Poets Prize, a prominent award in the world of poetry. Like Willis Kim, she was, they were pioneers. Finally, there's Elaine Kim, writer and scholar. She's a second-generation Korean American. She's the founder, one of the 2 or 3, of the UC Berkeley program in Asian American Studies, the first really in the nation, along with San Francisco State. So for anyone who has ever taken a course in Asian American Studies, who even knows anything about Asian American Studies or literature, it comes from the work of Elaine Kim. This book she wrote is still read, and her book defined how literature was read for 40 years and still now. And it's relevant, and it would not be an exaggeration to say she is Asian American Studies. So in other words, how we conceptualize ourselves in many ways as Asian Americans, our literary expression, all of us, it was a Korean American woman. Cha, Teresa Hak-kyung Cha. So Cha was a revolutionary avant-garde artist. This multimedia book is considered a groundbreaking classic that influenced poets in many decades that followed. It's a book that covers goes in, there's 3 languages: English, Korean, and French. There's mixed media. She wrote on women ranging from Joan of Arc to Ryu Guan-sun, who was the young Korean woman who led the March 1st protests against the Japanese. She wrote of her mother. She wrote of Greek goddesses. She was murdered weeks before her book came out. But this book is taught all across the country still in literature classes. She's considered one of the real leaders of the avant-garde artist movement. The 90s brought multiculturalism. So this was the idea that within a single nation, that there are independent cultural, religious, gender, or other affiliations that interact or dialogue with each other while maintaining their boundary of difference, okay? So people began considering the many ways we interact. Claiming a homeland culture was a mark of knowledge. The consideration of ethnicity and gender and belonging became more complicated because people would say like, oh, I know he is really not nice to the women who work for him, but you know, that's just his culture. So this kind of statement, it came into question. So they started to ask, what does that mean? So for the first time in the 90s was an acknowledgement of the diversity that might exist in a larger group. And with this came, again, an emergence of non-Korean characters in fiction, the writing about the Korean War by those who learned of it through research, not through living in it, and a branching out. A press was launched. People started writing young adult fiction, poetry, fiction, experimentation, and the literature was furthered by first and second generation immigrants, quite often the sons and daughters of the Korean post-war brain drain, not the plantation folks. This was often the sons and daughters of the elite. So while the Korean American narrative was diversifying, the authors of this narrative were being drawn from a smaller pool of mostly elite institutions. So the question becomes, who was or is writing the narrative of the United States? Who controls the narrative of Korea, Korean America, and what does this mean? One of the most significant Korean American literary figures, is Chang-rae Lee. His novel, Native Speaker, is a literary classic in its examination of how foreigners, outsiders, Asian Americans are perceived in American society. And his subjects have ranged from books about World War II and the Korean War to white suburban angst. He centered a white protagonist, and more recently to dystopia. There was also Susan Choi. So she is the daughter of a Korean immigrant father and a Jewish white mother. She won the 2019 National Book Award, and her works are often inspired by political or literary figures or actual events. Trust Exercise painfully addresses issues of gender or the power within an art practice and apprenticeship. But the book features no explicitly Korean or Korean American characters. They are elided. So her writing prompts the question, what is Korean American literature? So I bring us here to Toni Morrison, the late Toni Morrison, who was a Nobel Prize winner and often deemed the most important writer of the 20th century. And in her literary criticism book, she stated that experiences found in the Black community encompassed all of human experience. She never felt the need to center white narratives. She spoke to the significance of Black experience and centered it as American experience. So look at the question of the day. This is what I do for all my classes. I have a question of the day, and I want you to think about it. So, you know, how was or is the Asian American or Korean American used to create a white American identity, and what does this mean? So how do Korean Americans or Asian Americans refute or support the master narrative, right? Where are we? What are we writing about? Why? Okay. Min Jin Lee came on the scene in 2007, but it was her 2017 book about Koreans in Japan, a historical novel that garnered a National Book Award nomination. And Korean American writers are writing a narrative here here she is, that features only Korean, or as in the case of her first novel, Korean American characters. And again, it prompts the question, what is the state of Korean American literature? I put adoptee literature here all together, and this is not to say that actually they have much in common, okay? Because there's a wide range in subjects and genre. But what is interesting is if and when they explore heritage, it underscores the idea of Korean America as something that is learned, and that nation and memory are mythic. Okay, so you have a study on the significance of hoods. You have a study of suicide. You have a travel memoir. This is all written by a range of Korean American adoptees, and they need to take their place also within the idea of Korean American literature. And they can be fanned out, obviously, they cross genres. Okay, so I'm only grouping them together to kind of ask this question. And Korean Americans write across the genres. They write TV and detective stories like Leonard Chang. They write graphic novels like Derek Kurt Kim, and they write a ton of poetry, okay? So Korean American poetry really requires an entire separate lecture, and along with interesting stylistic elements, the idea of presence and absence is very much examined, okay? There was publishing a wide variety of fiction titles increased after 2000. Books covered religious fundamentalism, the Korean War, Black Korean relations, return to Korea, sibling rivalry, with locations ranging from Brazil to Hong Kong to Europe. The protagonists were Japanese, Chinese, Korean, white. And so it brings us again to this diversity. Nonfiction, these titles are memoir and travel. They were humorous, they were serious. Some, throughout the careers of the writers, they cross genre. They would write poetry and fiction, or fiction and nonfiction. And there are different kinds of political leanings and ideologies and perspectives that have now risen up. And this is the sign, this diversity, of a very healthy and lively literary community. We should not all be writing the same thing. This means that Korean American literature is in a good place. So Chrisley and Alexander Chi here are very different, and I point them out for this reason. Now, she lives in Korea. Her work explores the issues that face Koreans in Korea, for the most part, or recent immigrants. Alexander Chi, he's half Korean, openly gay, a leading figure of American literature. He writes into narratives that never exclude Koreans, but are not also exclusively Koreans or Korean Americans, okay? Finally, Don Lee, and I want to move to Don Lee as a pivotal figure. I think he's deeply significant in how he's shaping Korean American literature as a third generation Korean American who grew up overseas in Japan, the son of a diplomat. His characters have no distraught feelings about immigration. They experience racial conflict, but no one wants to get back to Korea. These are Korean Americans or Asian Americans who live an Asian American identity. And while other authors completely might abandon the Korean American or the Asian American identity, Don Lee embraces them. So he shows us potentially what might be the future of Korean American literature. Finally, I thought it was important to include people who are reframing how we see ourselves. So Jane Ji-hyun Park, a writer and Korean American professor now at Sydney University in Australia, explores how film uses images of Asia and Asianness to stand in for ideas of the future. Korean American Wesley Yang, an essayist, and Kathy Park Hong, a poet, both attempt to explore the question, who are we as Korean Americans, as Asian Americans, as women, as men, as creatives, and where do we fit in? What does it mean? So in conclusion, Korean American literature is the literature of pioneers, of movement, memory, and nation. It's a literature that you can be proud of to claim, that you should read, that might offer you some insight into your own life and the lives of those around you. And finally, it might be a body of work that you too, as a Korean American, may one day decide to contribute to. Please do. So that is it for today. Mahalo. 고맙습니다. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, so many awesomeness. Dr. Han, thank you so, so much. Can we give a round of applause first in just recognition of that amazing insights? Thank you, thank you. We've been having a little kind of love note in the chat box. I'm like, oh, I read that. Oh, wait, I recommend this one. You should all read this. I was just mentioning we need an actual summer book club at this rate to catch up with all the literature. And, you know, thank you for highlighting. One of my favorite parts of how you broke it down was just sharing the narratives, but in thematic because I think that's something unless you're intentionally trying to understand, we miss, right? It's like, oh, this is just an Asian American book, or this is a Korean American book, but you're really sharing that how it has evolved over the years, how that has shifted. What's something that maybe you could add that is often misunderstood about, you know, Korean American literature that you can share with us that we should keep in mind?
Well, I think sometimes the narrative of Asian America is really broad, right? So in the 1960s, this is when everybody became an Asian American. Like they just didn't even have the term until 1967. And it's constantly changing. So in other words, Indians, people of Indian descent, they petitioned to be called Asian in, I think, 1973. So they weren't even classified as Asian. And this group of Asian is always expanding. And actually Korean Americans, there's not that many of us. We're under 2 million, I think. Maybe we're hitting 2 million, but we have written a lot, actually. And so we need to make sure our narrative stays and is part of how Asian America is defined. So like I saw, you know, my little Korean American self, I saw like a best new Asian American books. And I thought, wait a second, why aren't Korean American writers on that? Because we are contributing too. But you have to remember, you know, people also are drawn to read. If you're Chinese American, maybe you're going to first read a Chinese American book. So get out there, read Korean American literature, share the titles, get involved in the narrative. Right. Why not? Make your voice heard.
Thank you for highlighting that. Every action matters. And I think I remember when I was having a little goosebump. I think what was the title again? Scrolling back, my Native Speaker. Yes, that I remember distinctly that moment when I was at the bookstore. I'm like, Mom, I think this author is Korean. The spelling is Korean. I remember that moment, and I remember being so mesmerized as the young one, just looking at the bookstore. I'm like, I've never seen a Korean book with English. It was often translated book, not like Korean American. And so us purchasing, us talking about it, reading makes a difference. And thank you for sharing how that's critical. I want to make sure if there's any questions that are already out there, if anyone has to ask, please make sure you put in the chat so maybe I can let you speak. But for now, I want to follow up maybe with another question, Dr. Han, for now, is that kind of continuing on that theme. We have a lot of folks here, both from different walks of life. And I'm sure one of the things that I wonder, that I'm curious is, okay, this is great to know, but other than reading, is there other things that I can do to better understand about my identity of Korean Americanness? What other actions I can take other than reading? Could you share a little bit more about that?
You know, reading is empowerment, but it's also writing and simply getting involved with your community. I mean, your presence as somebody who is Korean American and whatever you do, whether you're volunteering, whether you're participating in something for your community, it's important, you know, and it matters to you and it matters to other people. This is not to say we need to be perfect Korean Americans 24/7. That's just too exhausting. But know that whenever you get out there and participate in society, that you're making a difference for the community as a whole.
Participation, again, that form of action, making a difference on that. Connected to that, I mean, James Bull here from LA made a good question. It's like, okay, so then why are we not seeing more Korean Americans going into writing? I feel like it's tied to some of the cultures, but Dr. Han, could you share your thoughts and perspective to that question?
Yeah, so wait, so first let me, there's a question from somebody The second wave of Korean American immigration would be after 1910 till around 1945. 1.5 would fall under the post 1965 immigration group, and I think that was just a question from Kim Lee. So yeah, sorry, Monica. What was your question? It was just like
that's okay. It must have come to a private chat because I don't see it on my side. But James Bull from LA made a great point about, you know, why are there in fact not more Korean Americans going into?
Oh yeah, okay.
And I know you have a lot of thoughts on that, so please.
Yeah, you know, parents, they want people to have you know, the safety and security. You know, they would rather have something in their mind, expression and this kind of creative field is not something they think that is going to guarantee job security. And this is a normal reaction for parents, you know. But you know, there's all different kinds of ways that we make a life. And, you know, there's all different kinds of ways that we can define who we are. Who we are defined by isn't always what we do in our day job. You know, we define ourselves through people we love, through hobbies, through how we participate in the community. So you should feel free to live and do what you think your purpose is. Our job on this planet is not to fulfill our parents' ideas. Our job is to fulfill what our purpose is here on this earth, right?
Thank you for highlighting that and an encouragement of how we can reframe where we are. It's inspiring a lot of questions right now, and kind of one to highlight, for instance, there's Chelsea Choi mentioning, you know, how can we better understand the diversity layers of Korean American experience through literature? Could you start sharing?
Let's see, I'm trying to see where that is.
Yeah, so it's Chelsea Choi.
Okay, wait, I'm trying to, okay. I just think that it's just an example of the diverse ways that Koreans have had to navigate. It's not a sort of, you know, judgment. You shouldn't write this. You should write this. We don't know what individual experience is like, right? So just understand it by knowing that when you're entering a writer's mind, you're entering their imagination and what their experience really was. And we don't know what it is. It's our job just to try to listen and hold space for a while, you know, experience it, right?
Could you build on that? Because actually I just got another question from Kat Ko, who talks about what's the main difference between second gen Korean American writers and third generation?
Well, I think that what I noticed, that's why I highlighted Don Lee, because he does not write of necessary longing and the same kind of cultural apprehension about living in the United States, because after 3 generations, you're pretty much just here, right? You know, you travel and maybe you visit, but your sense of your family connection is very tenuous. It just doesn't exist in another place. So your subject matter is going to probably change. So I think and that's the natural evolution of American literature, because it is an immigrant country. That's what you see, right?
And there's been a few comments about, you know, in your recognition of your comment about, you know, it's not, writing is just one of the many forms of how this is being expressed. There's TV, there's art, and there's at least few comments about, well, it's great that we have Parasite. There's been some improvement with more Asian American voices that's being heard, but following up particularly from John So and Kim Lee Winslow's comment about, you know, the purpose of art, including literature, is to unify. So is it the case of art can divide as it is an expression of one person
Sure.
about their worldwide view? If you can share a little bit more on that.
Well, of course, when we think about ideas of art, when we think about creative expression, it's an idea of unity that is sought. Like, for example, when you read a poem, there's a turn in a poem where all of a sudden you're looking at the world differently, and it gives you a sense of completion. When we read a good book, we feel good afterwards. When we go to a good movie, that there's a completion, there's a sense of unity that we experience. And for most people, this is the ideal of what they're striving to when they are trying to give you a piece of art, when you are supposed to be experiencing a piece of art, whatever that unity is. However, we as individuals experience unity differently. What might be unifying for one person is, you know, heart attack causing in another. And that is normal too. And art can and does divide, but that is the purpose of it. It is about expression. And as Oscar Wilde said, artists are the future. And why sometimes we get upset is because we haven't seen this type of unity, or this grates against our ideas of what we know is right. And sometimes the artist is wrong. Sometimes the artist is right. You know, this is for us and for history and for the individual to experience.
And Chelsea Choi makes a great point in that, which I think alludes to what you just mentioned, is do you think then the model minority myth for Asian American has been reinforced, in fact, in the literature? And how can that barrier be broken?
Actually, I think a lot of literature is a defiance against that model minority myth, because what writers are doing is they're taking a story and showing an individual's thought. So an individual usually, when you're entering the head of the individual, doesn't necessarily agree with anything. We don't like stories like that. Who wants to read about John and Mary and their perfect life? You know, nobody does. It's boring. We want to hear that, you know, John was an amputee and Mary was having a secret affair, and John and Mary had, you know, different kids and 75 different lovers and hated each other, and somebody tried to kill somebody, but they ended up fine. I mean, we want to read stories about problems, right? So when you're, most literature in that sense is trying to step out and show there's a dimension, because what the model minority really is a one-dimensional picture of what we are as a group. It's a one-dimensional picture of an individual. We are much more than an image, right? And literature is attempting to deliver us a depth, an idea of us as complicated beings.
And Samuel Kim made a great point about, you know, that realization of like, right, like when we're in like traditional academic, even if we think of Asian American literature, we're only mostly assigned 1 or 2 books, and most of the other books are European or American classic. Like, he raised a good point about, I mean, how can we help change this? But I'm going to state that question, but also, Dr. I'm be curious if you then, out of all the books, like if there's 2 or 3 books that you recommend us to start, like maybe that could be another thought, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that, you know, what you have to do is view, in order for you to understand a degree of literature, it often helps to know, you know, the historical context of what you're reading. So it's not as if there's a loss if you keep reading. There's not a loss in reading Shakespeare. Why not? You know, the more you read, the better. Now, if you don't read at all, and there's plenty of high school students who just stop reading after high school, believe me, I know, I taught high school. You know, this is the tragedy, and this is why reading lists have to be diversified, right? But just keep reading. And I would maybe start with something like, you know, Native Speaker, to understand the myth of the model minority. Don Lee's book of short stories, if you're not a big reader, Yellow is great. You know, there's tons of Asian American. You want to read a travel memoir, you know, there's Trail of Crumbs. I mean, this was like an adoptee who like goes and falls in love with the Frenchman. I mean, there's like romance genres for anybody, you know. So what I would do is I would just peruse some. Now the early lit, I'll be blunt, like the writings of Henry Kim, we can take a pass on that. It's good for you to know that it's there because it's important. But that's a little bit, unless you're a scholar. And for me, I was very interested in researching. So I thought it was like really exciting, but I'm honest enough to tell you, you will probably not find it exciting unless you're writing a paper. And then it's way more exciting than a straight history textbook. Okay. So that would be my honest take. Young Yo Kang's book is significant, but again, that's like reading something from the 1930s. And if you're not a big reader, that's not a good place to start. I'm not of the school, you know, I've taught for a long time that, you know, reading should be miserable. If it's not fun, if you're not enjoying it after an hour and a half, forget about it. just give it away, return the library book. Who needs it? You know, why torture yourself? This is not assigned reading. It's supposed to be for fun. So find something you like. And another thing is that, you know, however well you read, and everybody reads differently. Some people are really good at numbers and science, and like when they read, it's a little bit of a torturous act, even if they enjoy it. We always read for pleasure one level lower than we read for school. Okay. So if you're like a serious, like you love reading critical theory and you're just like, you're headed into the sort of bowels of the history library for the next 75 years, fine. You can read whatever. Go ahead, read the Young Hill Kang, read whatever, because you can deal. If you're like, you know, I like going to movies and I like a little bit of other Korean stuff, then I would not point you in the direction of avant-garde poetry. You're just going to fall asleep. And I'm really blunt about this because I think it's best to be honest. So find a piece of fiction, find short stories, find something, you know, you read nonfiction, you know, read The Birth of Korean Cool, you know, read something that's kind of fun, you know, why not?
Thank you for giving the honest, unfiltered version so that we can have a transparent thought on that. I want to check in. I know we had a little technical issue, so if everyone is okay, and I guess most importantly, if Dr. Han's okay, I would love if I can still ask a few more questions.
Sure.
You know, perfect. Okay, so kind of following up on that one question tied to that, Abe Kim, appreciate it because you mentioned about, which I think ties very nicely to this current conversation, is, okay, are there then issues or topics that Dr. Han, that you feel that Korean Americans are not addressing in their work, which means would there be potential for today's writers to write more about fiction or nonfiction? So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think sometimes Korean Americans tend to, that's why I put in Toni Morrison, allied their real relationship to the American project. And I need us to think about this because, you know, everybody writes differently, but what is interesting is that there often is a jump where you are writing about a wider paradigm and all of a sudden Korean American or Korean characters disappear from the narrative. I don't even know how that's possible because you, the author, are Korean American. And anything you're writing, I mean, unless you're setting it in like outer space, but we all know there's this myth that everyone in the future looks slightly Asiatic and they wear turtlenecks, you know, like this is like, it's like when we see movies, everybody's like in spandex and turtlenecks and their eyes are kind of elongated. Like this is like, we're the sci-fi people of the future. But I think that's important because Toni Morrison did discuss, we even in our community or on the fringes of our community have full lives. We don't, I mean, I like, you know, why write about white people? There's plenty of, they're white and they're writing about white people. I don't know what the fascination is. I'll be totally blunt. I mean, you know, that's fine. More power to you if you do. And maybe you're one of these people and you just are totally into 13th century England. Great. But you know what? I'm sure randomly there might have been like a random Asian person there, right? There always is. There was a Silk Road. You know, we seem to think that we just only appear in places like Koreatown or something. This is just not true. I mean, I grew up in Iowa. We're everywhere, right? You know, there's like a Korean American phone book in Alaska. I mean, that we've been everywhere. So I think that that's what's important for us to remember is how we've dispersed and the diaspora and the significance of our experience. We do not have to disguise and hide behind whiteness because that is not who we are.
Which alludes to a great point because Keepum Park, if you are there, I'm going to just do a shout out. Congratulations on your first book. Do you want to take a moment and share? Because Keepum has a question, Dr. Han, for you, because she's wondering if you have any advice on steps she can take after her publishing process. But Keepum, if you want to take a quick moment and share about your awesome book, we've been doing some congratulations in the chat box, but we'd love to hear what that book is about so we can all support.
Yeah, why don't you tell us?
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. So I recently started on a nonfiction project of researching the topic of yellow fever. or otherwise known as Asian fetishization. And so in like a creative nonfiction route, I basically wrote about my own personal experiences, as well as a plethora of interviews from other people, and the historical background of how the fetishization came to be and the modern implications of it, and what it means to have an implicit sexual bias and how that leads to sexual racism in dating applications, and even when viewing things in Hollywood and literature, and how we all need to work on collectively fighting against this implicit bias.
Great topic. That's an exciting book.
Do you have any advice in what she should keep in mind?
I think that, you should look for support from other Asian American women in the Asian American community. I mean, we should all run out and buy your book. And it should be something that we should be talking about because this affects us, right? It affects all of us in the community, men and women. And it's something that can be discussed within larger channels of also women of color, African-American women and Latina women. There's different kinds of ways that they are fetishized and looked at and sexualized. And it's interesting to look at the comparisons and how this all speaks to really ideas of oppression through sexuality, so I think that it would be a good talking point really for women and a lot of women's groups, book groups, Asian Americans and otherwise, and I would contact people in Asian American studies who would be interested in women's studies.
Keep them. Did we get that? How do you feel? Anything you have follow up?
Thank you. I'm very nervous about the whole process, but yes, that's really great advice, and I will definitely be doing that. Thank you.
Great.
Congratulations again. And, that ties to actually, Bo James from LA's comment about, as somebody who studied Asian American studies at UCLA, do you want to share a little bit more about that context that you've shared and why you're feeling about this current conversation?
Hello, thank you so much, Monica, and thank you so much, Dr. Han, for this amazing talk. It just, like everything you said, like really resonated with me. I studied Asian American studies in undergrad, and I wanted to learn more about my heritage, but I realized that I learned that I didn't really learn much about it. I actually learned more about the other, like more likely like the Southeast Asian experiences, which wasn't like an issue for me, but I just often felt silenced. I'm so sorry. In a Korean talk, we have to cut out. But it just felt like my experiences were silenced. And I think I sort of talked about this with Sam in his office hours last week, where I felt like a lot of the Korean American were like seen adjacent to white people. I'm not sure if it's our color of our skin or also maybe our immigration story, but it also like that immigration story of like the model minority is the myth is doesn't apply to all Korean Americans. Like my family's super poor, we're like on food stamps and on welfare and all that stuff, but it seems like the Korean Americans, like I even had my occupational therapist ask me, like, he's like, oh, I watched Parasite. And he's like, is it like that in Korea? And I just felt like, I know he meant well, but I was just like, oh my gosh, like I'll never watch a white movie and then be like, oh, like an Adam Sandler movie and like go up to a white person and is like, is it like that? Like, do all white people do that? Like, I'll never say something like that, but it just seems like, I don't know, people are very ignorant. I know that was a very loaded comment, but I just wanted to know your thoughts.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate that the Korean American experience wasn't detailed more. And this also has to do with Korea in general in terms of foreign policy and how it's viewed. I mean, think about the fact that they label the Korean War, which, in which hundreds of thousands, millions of people died, the forgotten war. I mean, that to me is deeply, is an indication of how Korea plays out in the American consciousness, right? In the American narrative. And there's no way that it doesn't seep into other ways. Because the Vietnam War is more recent, and there was more of a, direct correlation between that and a particular time in the United States civil rights movement, that's often centered, right, when we think of war. Also, there was Japanese American internment, right? And then Chinese Americans, there was the Civil Rights Act, there was the Immigration Acts, right? So the issue that faces Korean Americans is one of visibility, is one of ideas of absence from a narrative. It's one of, where do we fit in, even within the context of Asian Americans? Where are we? And so if you think, what's interesting to me, Korea in Korean experiences are intersecting with the American idea of what a Korean American is, right? So the overseas Korean experience. But this is the issue within our community, and it's something, if people are in a class, in an Asian American Studies class, you raise the issue with your instructor. I would like to see more Korean American texts. Can you tell me more about this? I want to know. This is why I registered and I'm paying my tuition money. I mean, I hate to say it, but come on. This is, you're entering the classroom because you want some kind of knowledge. And if your instructor is open, either he or she should be willing to research it in order to learn alongside you, or should be able to point you in some kinds of direction, right? So hopefully, Bo, this was like, I'm upset you had this kind of experience, that you can, you have the tools of theory to read Korean American literature, to make sense of who you are. And just the few words that you said about your background, this is a story. Write your story. Your story is about being the Korean American no one thinks is Korean American. That's what you were telling me. Your story of who your family was. This also is the Korean American story. No, we weren't model. No, we didn't all go to the golf club. No, we didn't enjoy Asian American studies and get empowered. In fact, the opposite. And tell that story, because through telling your story, you will find empowerment, and you will give that story for other people to feel better too.
Well, James, how do you feel? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Han. I wanted to take a quick pause. Give me a thumbs up if you're feeling like getting some good insights, wisdom. This is powerful talk, insights. Love it. Thank you. Thank you. How timely, Bo, on your question, because another question I did get, Dr. Han, for you is that, okay, so then do you have any specific recommendation on books related to the topic of Chong? Because just like Nunchi, I think Chong, for somebody who wrote there, I agree, is a very special word in Korean context. For those who don't know, Dr. Han, if you're willing to share a little bit more what that Chong means and any book recommendation related to that.
Well, from what I gather, it's a kind of a deep kind of love feeling, right? Of a kind of understanding of love and connection, right? And I actually think that really comes out in most Korean American literature, because it becomes questions of community and questions of belonging. And this is also the crux of the sort of discord within the Korean American community. How are we individuals? How do we belong to a community? Can we love ourselves even if the community doesn't love what we're doing, right? How can I be accepted by the community? And am I going to seek validation from another kind of community? Why or why not, right? This is all an idea of connection, of love, of us wanting to feel that we belong. And this is the big question that most people have, how do we belong? Or we feel like we don't belong, and we look around and what's sort of that fear of missing out, right? Oh, they're having more fun. They're belonging more than me. But this is really also the human question. And we will never feel like we really belong until we belong to ourselves, meaning we feel we're okay, warts and all, right?
Thank you for sharing that. There's also been a lot of comments following up on that, on, you know, that concept of course, the model minority. Is there anything else, Dr. Han, that you could share lights, whether it's like books to read or just perspectives that you want to add on that topic?
You know, the model minority also is something to think about, this idea, because it's used as a wedge to divide us from people. It divides us from other kinds of Asians. It divides us from each other, you know, like, oh, your GPA was 2.5, mine was 3.9. Oh my God, what kind of loser are you? I mean, it divides us, right? Because the terrible thing is we start to believe it. So when we become oppressed by this rhetoric, which is designed to oppress us, so even if we know it's something wrong, we start buying into it. And really that's the danger of it, you know, and it divides us from other people of color. And this is also really important. You know, this is not to detract, to say that of course people want to succeed and do well, right? But being a model, you know, everyone defines what is good for their life differently. You know, for some it looks like this, and it's evidence in a lot of signifiers of capital success, and in others it's not. Others it's maybe, you know, I live in a tent and I'm on a bicycle going around the world for 3 years, not paying attention to what my parents are telling me to do, you know, so we don't really know. Or it's you know, so in other words, when we're buying into the model minority myth, we're buying into something that limits us. That's the problem.
And, you know, really going back to your statement about how it's important for us to tell our story. And going back to, I mean, just hearing from at least two, but many of these questions going back, and thank you all for those in the chat box. I mean, all your comments and insights, I hope you're reading it and finding a lot of resonating emotions and thoughts right now. It's important to take a moment and share, but also to be able to share, we need to first have the courage to dig deep within ourselves. Because as, you know, Dr. Han has expressed, and many of you have correctly pointed out, those stories make sense because our stories are all unique. But by us uniquely reflecting and telling our unique stories, there's somebody out there who could also resonate, which is kind of, I think, the crazy interesting thing is that we all have different stories and yet we can relate to it. But it's more relatable the deeper we actually dig deeply into those differences. Kind of as we reflect back on all of these, you know, amazing insights, Dr. Han, I'll be curious to hear, what are some final piece of advice or maybe thoughts that you want to share? If they're like, we thought and discussed about all these different things, but if they forget everything, what is at least a final piece of advice or like final perspective that you would want to remind them?
Don't say, so I'm going to add this because this was from Jay Park, who said something about Asian American studies, and that is to not let don't let a bureaucrat stop you. Just because an admin told you that your idea is not relevant, that's a bunch of shit, actually. Because if you look at what is going on in the geopolitical sphere and Korean Americans and Korea in a global sense, whatever you have to say about Korean Americans is relevant because there's a direct connection. And we can see this in the social ties and creative expression. So what you have to remember always is you need to keep with what you think is right. You know, you have to validate yourself first. And a lot of times people will not validate you because you are the first. They haven't seen anyone like you. So no, it's okay.
Thank you, Dr. Han, for sharing that. And, you know, I heard from the grapevine that we have a special treat. We also have attorney William Min, who's here, who was in fact key during the April 29 LA riots. And so are you currently here? We'd love to hear some of your insights and hear anything you have to share as well.
I thank you for broadening my insight to a new zone of culture and education. I lived here for since 1948, but your lecture today really introduced me into that area I was not familiar with. Back in 1992 riot, as you recall, that was blamed, the cause of the riot is blamed for the Korean Americans and their antisocial attitude. But that's a very, very wrong characterization, because I lived since 1948. Prior to 1992 riots, there were 17 major riots where Koreans were totally non-existent. They have never remedied the true cause of it, and later on demonized Korean for 1992 riot. Okay, that's very unfair. And my view, and your view too, is substantiated. What about this riot this year? Koreans have nothing to do with it, but the social evil has not been remedied completely. Okay, it's an ongoing assignment we have to undertake. And I really appreciate your view. I watched Korean American community grow from 1948, right after the World War II. There were only 1,000 Korean pioneer immigration population plus a couple hundred second generation. As you know, there are only few second generation population because there was immigration restriction, and a lot of them lived bachelor life and never got to marry. So only few people enjoyed having family life and second generation kids. And Korean presence really starts after 1960s, when Martin Luther King was fighting for the Black people's right. The immigration law around the same time changed, and we came in as a large number. And now then we became visible. Now then we learned to command some respect for our accomplishment, okay? And prior to that, we didn't exist. If I go to LA downtown in those days, you'll be lucky if you run into one or two Chinese customers in the department store. You never run into Korean customers because there aren't Korean population. But right now, you can find Koreans in any parts of the United States. I thank you for making Korean presence so meaningful and strong, and that's all your parents' effort and your effort, and people living in Korea who made such a progress in such a short period of time. I thank you. I just have one quick question, if you don't mind. Richard Kim, the writer, martyred, okay? I think he wrote with his experience in Korean War. He served the Korean War. Early 1950s, when he came over to the United States from Korea after completing his military service, I actually met him a few times because there was a few Korean student population. And he was already working on drafting English novel, and we were shocked to see, because in those days, English-speaking population was very rare, very limited English-speaking population we had, and he was already writing in English literature. One thing I noticed, his lifespan, I believe, was posted as 2019, no, 1919 to 2001. That should be rechecked, because Richard Kim is about a few years older than me, Korean War population, okay? So it can be 2019. He was approximately 4 or 5 years older than me. I'm right now 87. So Richard Kim would be about 92 if he, 90 or existed. And I think it's the same Richard Kim. He married a Caucasian wife, and he pursued literature, and he was very successful. And once again, there was just a minor housekeeping.
Sorry, I think we're having trouble hearing your microphone. That kind of got slightly.
Yeah, I have it. Yeah, you're right. It's 1932. I think I mixed the dates. 1932 to 2009. So yeah, I think it was switched.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for pointing it out, though.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. And I don't have too much to say, but I really appreciate this lecture. This is something I have never experienced living in the United States for 70 years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights. We really appreciate it. Can we give another big round of applause for Dr. Han, and also Elaine, thank you for sharing your insights. If you can give a round of applause, thank you. Dr. Han, any final words of wisdom, comment, thoughts?
No, just everyone do your own thing, really, and have faith that whatever you do is the right thing to do, and don't let anybody stop you.
Thank you. Thank you. So go dream big, continue to read the stories, support one another, and again, take a look, whether it's one book or another. But again, I loved, again, going back to Dr. Han's comment, if you find that book's not working, find another book. Don't let that stop you from really discovering, as well as everything else. Your story matters in every detail. Part of what you go through is helping shape that story, and somebody else is going to want to hear that story, and that's going to help them make a difference as well. So thank you all very much for all of you for your flexibility, staying onward. Again, just want to shout out again, we're continuing this. We're going to have another one next Wednesday. We're going to have a panelist to talk about what it means to be Korean American. They're going to share their different stories and journeys, as well as have join our next IgniteNextGen Facebook group, because I understand the link was not working well. So join there so you can get the correct link, and we'll send the email later on. But thank you all very much. I hope this has made you reflective, thoughtful, and off to a great Monday start. Many more discoveries to make, and we will see you all soon again. Fellows, we will see you Wednesday, and for others, we will see you later. Thank you so much. See you later. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.